Lab 7 Talkback. We're here with all the lovely Lab 7. We're going to ask some questions now.
7 is heaven.
Yeah. So, how did you guys come to name the performance Red-Handed, and what was the process that got you there?
I remember we were just talking about it in lab, and we were talking about, I think we were talking about colors, and like the things that colors signify. And then like I was like red-handed as a joke, but I was like, oh my god, that's like amazing. Like yeah, like we sorry. Go ahead.
I think it came from like the flashes too, because we're like, oh, let's have red flashes, and then we were talking about how we were gonna make the interaction. We were talking about like, oh, maybe they can do this or this, and it was always involving hands and like very like emotional thing. And then we were like, wait, what about if we incorporate both together? And then Mark just did his thing.
And then Mark took it very literally, and one rehearsal went, "Give me your hand," and painted by hand. Which
I remember we were doing rehearsals and like we were playing around with all the lighting and whatnot, and so we always had this idea of Bernie infecting people with his with touch. And as soon as Mark saw as soon as Bernie touched someone, we had an idea of having the detectives, which were Mark and Marissa, come in right when they so that they were catching him red-handed. And then Mark's just like, wait, that's a perfect title name. Like Red-Handed sounds great. And so I think it just stuck. So
yeah.
Amazing.
And then we decided to throw in the whole twisting of the hand of the people who
really
started feeling emotion, which furthered the concept.
Yeah, that was definitely something I was really surprised by when I saw it. I was like, oh, that's nice. The other TA who was sitting with me was like, something happened to his hand? I'm like, no, I think
yes.
It's supposed to be that way.
Alright, so what was your understanding of the piece, and how has it changed or evolved since we've started?
Well, our original understanding was that love will only go as far as fear will let it, and relationships will only go as far as to the certain point where fear starts to take over, essentially. And that came a lot from the two texts that we looked at with Unity and Love and Human Remains. Because a lot of them focused on that aspect of isolation as a result of fear. I mean, in Unity, you see people their relationships with each other start to kind of essentially disintegrate because they're so scared of catching this illness. And in Love and Human Remains, they won't even go as far as forming those meaningful connections with people. And so the two of them kind of just mashed together in that way. However, as time went on, the relationships and our process completely ended up changing our understanding. So it's completely different now. Now we kind of see it as based on what the final performance was. Our understanding is more along the lines of don't let fear hold you back from feeling something. And that comes from the fact that these people in this world that we've created are so emotionally detached. And that's sort of the dystopia that we were aiming to go to create. And yet there's this one person who's wishing to form these connections with people, and eventually he's the one that's able to break that barrier and get them to feel something, and go beyond that fear of wanting to reach out. And he kind of is the one that breaks that barrier and stops them from holding back. So that's kind of how it turned into that, just basically through our rewrites and through our molding and shaping of this new dystopian world. Kind of the new understanding came as a result of that.
Yeah, and I think also when we were writing and talking about it all together, we were also talking about the so what or whatever. We were kind of wanted it to relate to the people's understanding of modern culture or whatever, and kind of we talked a lot about the Tinder culture and stuff, and how hookup culture, and how people are it's easier for people to just hook up than actually have a meaningful relationship. And so kind of in an exaggerated way in this play, but we kind of wanted to point to that a bit too with our understanding.
Yeah, and then in lecture, Graham was actually talking about how people were no one will express themselves unless you're have alcohol in each other, and you're not allowed to say I love you to a friend unless you're drunk. And that was also an ascension of in the beginning we were oh, a relationship between two friends or something like that, but we're no, it really goes further than that. It's letting yourself feel anything is a problem in today's society, which kind of led our understanding to go that way.
It's just the fear of showing how you feel because you don't know how other people will react, and it's you should just kind of do you.
Awesome. Okay, So after our first run through with Jen and Graham, what of their feedback do you guys take to shape the final performance?
Oh god,
Oh,
everything.
Yeah.
Remembering lines.
I think the main one was the fact that the narrative structure was very, very incoherent, along with our really, really novelized but difficult to understand idea. Made it so it's very difficult for them to understand, because once we actually told them what was going on and who these characters were, they were like, oh, okay, I get it now, but none of your audience members are going to get it. So the way we kind of restructured it, and then it came to the final performance where we had the detectives beginning to talk to Birdie, and then he tells his story throughout the way. We made it very, very more coherent.
And I feel like we based it off, sort of built it around the audience experience.
Yeah.
We tried to put ourselves in the audience's shoes and see, okay, what pieces of the puzzle are they not getting?
Yeah.
But we didn't want to be so obvious, like, here's this, here's that sort of thing. And we wanted to be able to provide that sense of mystery without hitting the thing over the head.
Yeah.
So we took the flashback and framed it as such.
Yeah.
So.
Because the big thing I think is that by the time we performed it for Jen and Graham, like, we were so comfortable with this world, and we had it completely fleshed out. We thought of everything at this point, but of course the audience is not going to understand like weeks and weeks of a thought process in 15 minutes, right?
Yeah,
So what we really needed to do is, although a lot of times it kind of felt like we were being too simple, we had to step back and think, okay, yeah, but this is going to make sense to the audience. So it was a matter of matching our weeks of understanding with what the audience will be able to see in a short amount of time.
Yeah. And we even sorry.
That's when you go.
Okay, we even leading up to the final performance, we would have people kind of sitting in the audience and watching when they weren't actually on stage, being like, okay, that doesn't communicate, and then making just small changes to further the understanding of the audience. So I feel like we were really thoughtful with the audience.
Yeah.
I think a really big change we had to make too was like showing that it was this dystopian world where people didn't have feelings. So like, because originally we only had the rules a couple of times, like the no touching, no feeling, etc. And I think that was one thing that like once we amped that up a bit, it was very clear that it's like we don't feel anything, but we also don't want to feel anything, and we know that it's wrong. I think once we kind of incorporated that into it more, where like not just like that it was said over the speakers, and it was repeated by the characters, and it was repeated by the police officers or the detectives, sorry, it really made it clear like, hey, we don't have emotions. And so like that made it much more obvious when Chris came on as Bernie and was like, oh, like, you know, even the way he walked was a lot different, and so like it showed the difference between like the no feeling and the why not.
Yeah. I think the use of a slogan or like a mantra that we were using, I think that was probably one of the most helpful things we could have done with creating our world.
Yeah.
For sure, because it really just like, it was a way of really emphasizing it without being too tacky. We just kind of like incorporated into like a normal part of this world's life.
Yeah. There were definitely, like, even like starting from the beginning, there were a lot of major overhauls we did in terms of making it coherent, as Ben was saying.
Yeah.
Like we had characters that that eventually got cut, and like the narrative style was more fitted around this sort of detective's point of view rather than Bernie's, and so that got cut, and it eventually, like, we eventually found that it was being sewn together more coherently, and I guess I mean the cuts that we made were actually really good, and I think they held to it for the performance.
They did their job.
In terms of like how Graham and Jen said that, like, you know, the audience didn't really understand this world, of course, because we think about this world so much, and that it was, you know, weeks of understanding. I think also he was talking like the way we use like cards and hand sanitizer to further that understanding, to just another mode of interpretation for the audience. So I think that also really helped as well.
Yeah, and that really got the audience involved too. Like, and they're like, they wanted to kind of know like, why are these people with gloves and masks coming up to us?